So continuing the Maamer we're learning, the Chomocha, Tofresh Choptes, from the Rebbe Marash, we're describing and showing that the energies from Hashem come through our hierarchical structure. We are talking about that the energies of Hashem don't just exist from nothing, but pass through a hierarchical structure from higher to lower spiritually. When something happens in the world, in the physical world, say a blade of grass grows, it means that there is a divine energy within that blade of grass telling it to grow, causing its growth, meaning to say that that energies from heaven, from the spiritual realms, are going through the spiritual infrastructure, and it is the cause of the growth that exists in this blade of grass, for instance. He brought another example, and he brought the example of the rooster, the idea that in the physical world, the rooster crowing is to awakening people who are in the awakening from sleep processes, from night process to day process. In the spiritual world, in the conceptual spiritual world, in the world of Bria and Etzira, in fact, the concept of the rooster crowing is that the angel Gabriel is similarly waking up the souls in Gan Eden, and even higher than that in the higher spiritual world, in the realm of Atzilus, it is the divine attribute of Bina awakening the attribute of Malchus in Atzilus, calling it back up to its source to re-energize, so that it will have energies, more spiritual entities to re-energize in its next cycle all the creations. So then we said, so this is the idea that the crowing of the rooster is that the divine attribute of Bina, which represents knowledge, embracing knowledge, is awakening others, and hence the connection of our morning blessings. When we say we make a blessing of who gives the roots, we give a blessing of Neisen Sech Vivino, who gives the rooster wisdom, and we spoke about that. That's the inner connection between the idea of a rooster awakening in the morning and wisdom. So in conceptual idea and in reality, we see that there is a distinct connection between this. So if we continue where the paragraph heading says Yesh Ma'ayin, and we go into the Hebrew, it says, V'hinei im hoya hishtalshelos levad. Now, if there would be, in the process of creation, only a structure of Seder hishtalshelos levad, what that means is, if there would be only the evolvement of the infrastructure of the spiritual worlds to the fixed physical world, and there would only be a infrastructural creations that went through the process of cause and effect. Now, what does that mean? We understand in the spiritual world that there, and in the physical world, right, there is this idea of a cause and effect. A cause is the initiator, the effect is the resultant entity that comes out of it. In our understanding of the spiritual worlds, God is the first emanator. God creates things in the world, but he creates it via a Seder Ishtalshlis, via a chain-like contribution from a higher realms to a lower realms, from the higher spiritual worlds to the lower spiritual realms. And each stage of the emanations of Hashem is a step down from higher spiritual level to a lower spiritual level process in the world. But our statement that we just said, the line that we just read, tells us a very important idea, that even though we understand and there exists in the spiritual realm the cause and effect nature of spirituality, a Seder Ishtalshlis, notwithstanding that spiritual infrastructure, that organization going from a higher to a lower realm, that's all within spiritual energies in the spiritual worlds. And therefore, going back to what he said, if there would only be a Seder Ishtalshlis, if there would only be a spiritual realm of descendants from one stage to the other from the spiritual worlds, then continuing his text, right? Then lo haya yochel liyas metzias. There would not be able to be metzias dover gashmi klal. There would not be able to evolve a physical thing, a physical entity. Ki hoya hakol rak ruchnius, because everything would be then locked into some sort of spiritual form. Because one spiritual form can manifest itself and be a cause and affect another spiritual cause. But something to be in the realm of physicality, that can't evolve via a Seder Ishtalshlis, via a downward step progression of cause and effect, because it would remain in the realm of spirituality. Because the leap between spirituality to physicality is immense, is huge, is unsurpassable. There has to be some special mechanism that causes something which is in spiritual and to have an existence in the physical realm. And that's the effect of a special input from Hashem himself, because in essence, spiritual and physical are two opposites. The spiritual realm and the physical realm are inherently not connected. So in order to leap and go through the boundaries between spiritual and physical, the boundary is too significant and needs a special input from Hashem to be able to do that. Now, the Maamer itself progresses and takes that as an assumption, as a constant, as something which, as a knowledge which you already, with assumed knowledge that you already know. He said it in a statement, and how he expands on it slightly. So let's just read the Hebrew text, continuing. Ki im hoya ribui rabobas madregas ishtalshalis. For if there would be even thousands and thousands of different myriads and myriads of steps of cause and effect, you would not be able to create physicality from spirituality. Because it would always have an aspect of ruchnius in it. To jump to the physicality is too difficult. Continuing, and kedei shiye metzias gashmias, and if and in order that there should be a created physicality, an entity of physicality, that has to be done through bria, through creation, yesh ma'ayin dafka. It can only be through the process of what we're calling yesh ma'ayin, creation of a being, something from nothingness. And as expressed in other texts, Kamayim Bal HaIkrim, like the author of the book called the Ikrim, tells us, that the creation of physicality from spirituality, to create physical matter from spirituality, there's no such greater creation than changing something which is spiritual into something which is physical. Now, we have the benefit of using the book, and we can look at the translation and the explanations, and we can have a look at the explanation there in note 76 and have a look what he says over there. So,
what number is that?
76.
We're still reading the 76. Yes.
So although there are myriad stages of progressive involvement, they all remain spiritual. The creation of physicality, that is matter, as something from nothing, cannot come about by a way of ilah and olul, cause and effect. It is a given that Hashem exists in a spiritual sense. Hashem's energies are in a spiritual sense, and they create. But how do they create? They create through cause and effect. The infrastructure is created by the spiritual cause and effect. But nevertheless, regardless the amount of degrees that separate the final product from the initial product, a physical entities is impossible to come out. That is because the final olul is inevitably affected by the original ilah. That is, the final effect is inevitably affected by the original cause. And that effect is contained within it, albeit in an undefined state, even before the olul energy comes into being. And if the olul is a spiritual entity, then the final product can be nothing more than a less refined form of spirituality. Moreover, the final olul is initially contained within the first ilah, that is, the final effect is initially contained within the first cause, even if only in extremely indistinct form. Physical matter, by definition, as we mentioned before, physical and spiritual are completely different. So therefore, physical matter, by definition, cannot be contained within spirituality. Matter must be therefore created, now, yesh ma'ayin, by God himself. And this is the idea of yesh ma'ayin, a being from nothingness. We utilize in English that expression, ex nihilo. It is creation from a state of nothingness. In contrast to ilol olu, matter does not exist within the realm of spirituality. So the source of a yesh of matter, because matter, physicality, doesn't comprehend and grasp in totality the spirituality. It knows it exists, it knows it's there, it knows it has some sort of sense of entity, but nevertheless, because he doesn't understand it, it's called nothingness, because it's nothingness relative to the mode of being and perception of the yesh. And in our lexicon, in our framework, the emergence of yesh is therefore called hischatshus. Hischatshus means new, it's originality, it's innovativeness. It is something which didn't exist before. Since it wasn't there prior to its existence. In the realm of spirituality, physicality doesn't exist. Physicality has to come to an existence from not its own state, but from somewhere else, from God creating it, something different. From the yesh's point of view, from physicality's point of view, he doesn't understand spirituality. So therefore he calls, or from the framework of a yesh, or physicality, we call spirituality an ayin. We call spirituality a state of non-being, a state of nothingness. Continuing. The existence of the yesh is always dependent on the ayin to bring it being, since it has no independent existence. And in a comparison, a yesh may be compared to a ray of sunshine. If the Tanya teaches us that the analogy of a sun ray in relationship to the sun itself, the sun ray is inconsequential to the globe of the sun, and the sun ray has no existence, no independent existence, if the sun were extinguished. And its existence has a dependency on the sun itself. In the spiritual realm, as we have said, all the Seder Ishtalshalos, that infrastructure, all has dependency on Hashem's energies that is giving it. In the spiritual realm, that is obvious. In the physical realm, our own physicality, that's not so obvious. We don't always understand it that way. We don't appreciate it that way. We don't see it that way. What we see is that we have some knowledge of an ayin, a nothingness, and all we can describe about it is that it is ayin. Now, further, so we have discussed that line that we mentioned in the main text, the idea of that if there would just be the creations in a spiritual sense, no physicality could exist, would be created from it. It takes a special bria yesh me'ayin was the expression, creation something from nothing, bria yesh me'ayin, in order to create the physicality, our existence. We're continuing our line of thought that everything in the realms of spirituality has parallels in all the realms, in all the spiritual realms before that. Even so, all the different worlds and all the different existence exist in different planes of godliness. So let's continue with the text of the Maamer. V'nimtzo, therefore it turns out, ki hagam shelachol dover v'dover meprote hanivroyim, so that it turns out that every aspect and all the details of all the creations of the three worlds of Bria, Yetzira, Asiya, Yeshorish Mocha Lamaila Baruchni. So even though their energies have a source in the original realms and a root in the original realms, Baruchnius in spirituality, that's giving them life and energies. Like the example that we mentioned, Kamesherish Atanago, like we said, that the source of the rooster, the Tanago, is who Gabriel is the angel Gabriel, Ulamayli Yeser, and in the exalted realms of Atzilus, beyond that in Atzilus, who Bechinas, it is of the realm of what's called the Hey Gvuras, the Amo, the five severities, five aspects of severity of Amo. Amo is a reference to the level of Bina, we mentioned that before. Hayatzrichas liyas tchilo, in order that those myriads of levels, give energy to the creations below, there has to be there have to be the myriad stages of evolvement of the spiritual infrastructure, and then and afterwards mishava hadova, and then after those energies have evolved in the lowest, in the sense that they have come down to a lower level of spirituality, then the creature, then the object which is created, Bria Yesh Ma'ayin, can happen and be a receptacle for the energies of the spirituality. Maamer then continues and says, once we've explained this idea of the hierarchical spiritual structure, and that there is the idea of Seder Ishtalshalis, and moving forward with Seder Ishtalshalis, there has to be, after all the myriads of the level of Seder Ishtalshalis has been created, then we have a creation created Yesh Ma'ayin. So with that as an understanding, we can understand the cryptic comment that we mentioned before at the beginning of the Maamer. The text continues. So also we can understand in this text, in the concept of the Maamer, when we mention the Pirkei Rabbi Elazar, we mentioned that quote from Pirkei Rabbi Elazar, Sha'omar, where it was said, Ha'eretz ma'heichon nivrais, from where is the world created? And he answered, Mishelek shetachas akisei kobed, is created from the snow that finds itself under the throne of glory. Now, this is a very cryptic comment. What does this exactly mean? If, as we're going to continue on the text, if this is a reference to physical snow, how snow exists in a physical state in our experiential world, then we would go further and we would have to ask, Hainu, we have to say tzrichin l'shoel. We have to then first ask and say, where does snow come from? Where does snow take its existence from? If the world and its creations take existence from the snow of underneath the tichas tachas hakavod, if that's a reference to something physical, so where did that physical thing come from? In a similar sense, when does land come from? So we must discount this idea that this question is in any way related to something physical, that the snow relates to anything physical. But we must say that the ha'sha'inyan ha'sheleg, that the idea of sheleg, the idea of snow, is really a reference to something else. It's really a reference to a different idea. Sheleg, in fact, is a reference to something else. It is really an acronym. It is really an example of an idea that he wants to impart with us in a hidden and secret manner. In what way is this? Well, before we continue on, so let's just review what the sentence said. The sentence from Pirkei Rabbi Elazar said, how is the world created? From the snow beneath the throne of glory. What that really means, now that we've said that sheleg is a hidden intent word meaning, the answer to the question is, how was land created? It's taken whatever concept we're going to explain in a second about sheleg is, and sheleg was used, and sheleg, which resides underneath the level of the throne of glory of Hashem, which is another mystical concept, it was used to snow, but really its intent is what's embedded in this idea of snow, and snow not being snow, but meaning something else. That's what was used to create the world. So what is this snow? She'inyan hasheleg. Now he continues, Ella, she'inyan hasheleg. Hu bechinas. But sheleg is really a hint to the idea of yechidas asires mayas, meaning literally ones, tens, and hundreds. That is the conceptual idea of what's embedded in the numerical ideas of units and tens and hundreds. Meaning that, he continues, sha'agimel hushleisha b'yechidas, that when we talk about the gimel of the word sheleg, we mean an idea that there are ones. The lamed is to teach us that there are tens. So sheleg refers to the letter 3. but and to the numerical value of 3, because its numerical value is actually 300. But the idea that there can be units. That's the gimel, and that are digits. Halamad implies to us the idea of 30, and that is that there is units of tens embedded in 30, right? So in Gimel there's 3 sets of ones. In Lamed there's 3 sets of tens, and the letter Shein has a numerical value of 300. But that's 3 units of 100s. What's the idea behind that? The idea behind that is that there is structural hierarchies of units, tens, hundreds. Okay, with that knowledge, right, we go further, and that we understand that there are stages of evolvement, stages of creation, which are represented in units, tens, and hundreds. The idea that there is this complexity, and that the complexity comes down and is created in a chain of more simplification and more simplification from the idea of hundreds, tens, and units. It's continuing his words. So therefore it comes out, ki bachinas yechidas asiris meyas, this idea of units, digits, of bachinas yechidas, of digits, tens, and hundreds, hey bachinas, they refer to the different evolvements, the deconcentrating from the higher realms to the lower realms, or from the lower realms to the higher realms. That is to say, they refer to, in the structural componentry of a spiritual world, they refer to the level of, in spheres called Malchus, Zor, and Bina, which they become the source of land. And in order for that source of land to come through, in order for the spiritual infrastructure to be created in the spiritual realms, and to go down from the higher realm to the lower realms, it had to be reduced from the conceptual ideas of the hundreds down to tens to ones, or in reverse order, the ones down to tens to hundreds, and devolve or evolve in that sense of the spiritual infrastructure, a cause creating an effect, and then a further cause creating effect and multiplicity. And therefore he continues, and then after that, after which all that spiritual infrastructure is evolved, there comes a creation, bechinas metzias ha'oretz gashmi, you can have the creation of the physical world. And this idea that it comes from tachas kisei hakavod, that it comes from underneath the crown of glory, of the throne of glory, that means that under the palace of Hashem, a lower realm comes a higher realm, comes from a more simpler sense. It devolves to in a more complicated sense and empowers all the other things below it in a more devolving sense, like the idea of a ministry, hierarchical ministers, managers, workers, etc., with the different numbers that exist there. So a further explanation we can find in the text at note 82, the idea where the concept of digits, yechidus, asiris, and mayos, correspond to the spheres. They correspond to the idea of the spheres in that each one is a more complex version of the other, meaning that units refer to Malchus, tens to Zor, and hundreds to Mechem, and thousands to Keser. The idea being, as he says to explain, the tremendous amount of gradations causes God's light to be reduced progressively until the level of Malchus, you feel only one level, the level of one. That is, one unit out of 1,000, if that is to say that we would explain that Kesser would be equivalently the intensity of spiritual light, like of 1,000, that has been reduced to a level of 100 within Bina, and that gets reduced to the level of 10 in Zoh, and then 1, and then to level of 1, and the level of 1 to Malchus. The analogy being like the idea if a teacher wanted to pass on an idea or logic to a student, and the way that the student understands this idea is incomparable compared to the way the teacher understands the idea. The idea as it's understood by the teacher is fully formed with all its details and all its different insights. And then the teacher passes on this information, but it has to reduce the intensity of the information down as he progresses it inside of himself, compresses the idea and passes it on to the student from the highest level that he might have it to the way the student can grasp that. So initially, and even though the teacher might want to embed all information in it, he tries to impart the knowledge so that the concept is understood by the student. That's and therefore in this respect, we talk about the highest level of spirituality being in the realm of 1,000. Within the world itself, it goes from the hundreds to tens down to the ultimate progression when we give it over to one. That is the level, the intensity of the idea is passed over in that way. So therefore, coming back to our original statement from Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar, how was the world created? It was using Sheleg. What does that mean? That means that the world was created, that the world was created by reducing the intensity, the spiritual energies down from the levels of the high levels of intensity down to a level which would equivalently be like compared to the level of units through the processes of the spiritual hierarchy embedded within the worlds. And if we go to the analogy in human terms, the head contains all different types of energies for the diverse functions of the body. It's contained in original source, all the capabilities for the entire body, but then becomes a digitized and reduced to the specific units of the body. So therefore it becomes lower. And what's unique for the different limbs is given to the energies for those specific limbs. And as it goes down to it, as it progressively goes down in function. And this also ideas it refers to the spiritual worlds in the realm of Bria, Yetzirah, and Siyah. They bring down the higher realms and reduce it and filter it down to the lower realms, and it becomes an intermediate, and levels of the higher levels become an intermediate to the lower levels to give energies to the lower levels according to their idea. But this is the idea of the sheleg, of going down from the hundreds, from the tens to the ones, to the units. Now the Rebbe Marash gives points on an aside which is somewhat similar, and we'll have a look at that with a little bit of reading. Okay. Now the same idea and nearly the same wording is in another place in the Medrash. Our quote that we were working on just now was from the book called Pirkei de Rabbi Loza. So now to the version of this teaching in Medrash Rabbah, the Rebbe Marash continues. Reish Parshas Bo Shegerim Ma'ofo Mitachas Akisei HaKoved. Here the text that's used in Medrash Rabbah talks about the dust which is underneath the throne, or the earth which is underneath the throne of glory, essentially being the same idea. Why is that? Because earth represents, or dust represents, the level of Malchus, and conceptually this would be the same idea. Kaneda Mamasha Kosova Mokamacha, as he references here, as the Rebbe references another place, Mokamacha Meiyan Offer Shabakaka Mishkan, where he references the idea of the earth that was used, of the earth of the use was the floor of the Mishkan, in Ofra Debe Mikdosha La'elo, and reference over there. We will further discuss this in more detail later on, and just continuing the next few lines to complete this idea. Previously, when we first introduced that Pirkei de Rabbi Lozer of the idea of the snow underneath the Kisei HaKoved, we also mentioned the idea of talus and the light, and we quoted that. So he also now continues on, and he says, Kamei Kain, in a similar fashion, who be hinyan is era. When we said before when we mentioned before the creation of light, we mentioned sure, and the Medrash mentioned over there, Hisavas era, the creation of light, Shur Meman is Atar Batalis, was that Hashem wrapped himself up Batalis Lavena in a white talis, Dafka, who Bechinas Lavushas Kesele Kibur. The purpose of that is that he wanted to emphasize the idea of a wrapping that is similar to the idea of Kislev Kibur, white snow, Sha'al Yedei Lavush, through this white snow and through the wrapping himself. And what does a wrap do? It mailim, it covers himself. Therefore, Yochalias Metzias, his Abbas, he would give the capability of light for light to create objects of physical entities or lower spiritual entities, al yedei rabobos madregas, through the multitude of different levels of ishtalshlus, of a seder ishtalshlus v'achachach b'derech bria yashem bria yesh ma'ayin, and afterwards there will be the creation of something physical, bria yesh ma'ayin. So I covered these lines just reasonably quickly. Conceptually, it's the same idea as what we said, that through enwrapping himself, a person wraps himself up and covers himself over, therefore his brilliance can't be seen directly. That's the idea of reducing his effect, his energies from those 100s down to 10s to 1s, in order to create spiritual infrastructure in a lowering manner, in a descending manner, and thereby be able to, after that infrastructure is created, to have creation bria yesh ma'ayin. Okay, so we've used these notes. We'll come back to this and do this in a little bit more detail to flesh it out when we meet again and do another class on this.